Hi, welcome to the third season of the Emmy-nominated show Drop the Mic on CCP-TV, the educational channel of Community College of Philadelphia. I'm Michelle Myers, the host and co-creator of Drop the Mic. I'm joined today by one of our esteemed judges, English professor Elizabeth Catanese, and Lindo Yes, the featured poet from episodes 1 and 2. The performances in season 3 of Drop the Mic, recorded in the fall of 2016, turned out to be particularly powerful, especially considering national and international events of the day. So we thought it might be useful for us to provide some perspective for viewers. And in particular, one of the things that we were really concerned about was that many of the poetry talks about issues like police brutality and other topics that many of our viewers might find to be offensive, or they might have very strong emotional reactions to it. And so what we hope to do by having these roundtable discussions about the poetry is to talk about how we can kind of break through those moments where a viewing audience or an audience in general might shut down completely and not listen to the message. What we're really interested in is encouraging an audience to really listen to those messages and for us to be able to facilitate dialogue and hopefully to learn from one another, connect from one another. So with that being said, I'd just like to ask both of you what you thought about the poems. Was there anything that stood out to you in particular that you'd like to start talking about?
I think for me, it was Gavin piece when they perform. I'm forgetting the title of it right now, but when
they said it was called Indian Giver.
Yeah, I thought that was great. That's talking about a sense of identity and a sense of just like how you can be perceived as one race, even though you have heritage. And another place that you need to, inform people and how, working on that identity, because I think a lot of people that are in blended families or mixed race, deal with that struggle on a daily basis, and a lot of times we're not as woke to those issues as possible. And I think, she hit it right on the nail of like talking about it and being really explicit about it, because I think there's one thing to say that, I'm mixed race and, I'm dealing with this identity. In the shapes of like, how am I getting my foot in both worlds, or how am I just trying to define myself, but also just knowing that you're perceived as one race or one identity is another story as well. So that stood out to me a great deal.
Yeah, I agree. I thought that Gavin's poem was a very powerful poem. I think, as the judges pointed out, when Gavin first came in, they seemed to be very quiet. They seemed to be very introverted, very much into themselves. And then as soon as they got on stage, it was like, wow, right? And so it was all this power and all this energy as they were on stage. And the other thing I really appreciated about this particular poem, it was a response poem. They were responding to someone who was saying that they should wear their culture more, so that people would know that they were Native American. And what they were kind of talking about is cultural appropriation, the way in which American popular culture, American culture in general, has this ignorance about Native American culture and just kind of reduces Native American culture to stereotypes and not knowing really anything at all about the oppression and the continued oppression of Native peoples in the United States. So that was very important.
Let's talk about it, yeah.
They also had that line that was, you say I should have to wear my culture, but you'd have to give it back. And I think that was very powerful to me. About appropriation.
And then, another thing that I thought was really powerful that they spoke about in their poem was, and again, this goes back to these very real historical moments where Native American people have experienced oppression at the hands. And this we know about the smallpox and the blankets, right? And we know about the stealing of lands and them being relegated to reservations, and most of them not even on their native tribal lands, right? But one of the things that she talked about that many people might not have really heard, because she was also, they were also speaking pretty quickly with their poem. They were talking about their grandmother, and they had mentioned how their grandmother had been sterilized at the hands of a doctor who had removed their grandmother's uterus. And that was something that actually did historically happen to Native Americans in the 1970s, where we had white doctors who were going onto Indian reservations, volunteering, saying they were there to help the Native American community, and then they would do these routine surgeries on Native Americans, like remove their appendix, and then they would remove the uterus of Native American women, and obviously rendering them sterile and effectively preventing the growth of further generations of Native American peoples. And once Native American peoples found out about that, they really saw that as another form of genocide being enacted against their people. And so just to bring up that as something that, for Gavin, very personal in their own lives, but also something just many Native American women experience, to bring that and exposing that and making sure that story is being told, I thought was very powerful, very important. Yeah.
And I think this speaks to the strength of poetry in the sense of just like, it gives us commentary through, someone's own experience, and allow us to, be in that moment and create, a sense of just knowing, because otherwise, how do we hear these stories? How do we hear those stories from, someone that's actually experiencing it, versus like when it just comes from an anchor who's so removed from the situation that, it's just, I'm just glad that she did that piece. And I thought it was empowering. I thought another thing that came out of this episode that was really empowering was people talking about mental illness. Like, depression came up a lot, and it's like a really real thing. And I think, just speaking on my own experience, it's sometimes amongst my family, it's treated like, oh, it's going to be a phase, it's going to be a passing thing. But I think the real story is it's like something that you endure and you learn how to get through. And I'm so glad that the more we talk about it, the more it becomes a normal conversation we can have, so we can be more progressive and helping out individuals that had that. And I thought, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, Daria?
Yeah.
De'Ara.
Pardon me. And I thought, this episode was so somber because it came up so much, like, and how you pronounce her name again?
De'Ara
piece where she was just like, it was a very soft-spoken poem, but it was just like, at the same time, it was so chilling on just like how like somber it was. And it was just like, oh man, she's talking about something that is just like, you just want to give her a hug and just make sure she's okay. Like, let her know that she's not alone. And, Black Cancer spoke about it as well. And then, man, it came up a lot.
De'Ara, nonfiction, Black Cancer, Nick. I think we can actually say almost everyone kind of talked about it. Even Lil SV, taught in some ways in terms of his battle rap, seems to be talking about railing against those kinds of negative, the responding to an outside environment where all one hears is negative, and you're never going to amount to anything, and et cetera, right? Hearing that constantly, and then, having that being echoed within one's own head, and then that's what one is saying to oneself, that I'm never going to be anything, and that leads to, other kinds of negative thoughts. And so these inner voices that are just always negative, and I think you're right, like leading to depression, leading to self-doubt, insecurities, even so far as self-hate. This very feeling like spiritually depleted, spiritually, just
De'Ara says the line, "I'm hiding these unbearable feelings," and I think part of it is the inability to speak out, like you were saying, Lindo. And I think that the storytelling within the poems allows people to get out the feelings that feel completely crushing and unbearable. And Shawnee D said the line, "You don't know my story." The haters, I'm going to turn the haters into motivators. I want you to hear what my story is.
I thought Shawnee D also had a really great line where he said, no one to run to, but I ran still. Like, that was empowering, because it's like in the sense of just like, all right, I know I'm dealing with a lot, and I know that there might not be someone that I can rely on, but there's this sense of just like independence that I have, that I know I can run this, I can do this, I can continue in the sense of like enduring, overcoming. I have the will within myself to do, even if I feel as though the support is not around me. And I'm like, no matter how somber the piece is, there's a sense of just like empowerment, hearing these stories, knowing that these people no matter how the piece ends, no matter if it ends at a note where it's still about, all right, I'm still in this place or I'm overcoming this place. The fact is these people are talking in front of us shows that they're making such a step of just not only making us aware, not only, individual like me that feels that all the time, like I'm depressed like crazy. And it just makes me feel like I'm not alone. I have people in the room that are, trying to deal with these issues as much as I can, and also they're finding ways to overcome it. And this is one of their like steps of just speaking out loud, letting people know that you're not alone. I'm not alone, and I found a way to, combat these feelings, to overcome. I think it speaks to the strength of this episode of just like having these silent moments and having as well as these empowering moments from just being on stage.
And Dar the poet said the line "freedom is an attitude," and I think that could really be translated to what you're saying, right? Like, even though all the circumstances may be horrible and there's this whole big history to deal with, there's something about freedom coming from within, from story sharing, from realizing that you're worthwhile and you should be sharing what's within you. Yeah. And that causes freedom.
Yeah, and I think also to kind of try to expand on some of these points, I think it was really interesting. So the story sharing in order to make a connection, but also story sharing so that just one can find the resolve in oneself to overcome. And I thought was really interesting is that so much of what many of the young poets or these emerging poets that were on the show were trying to say was like, I'm sharing with you who I really am. That was like, who am I? Like, where am I from? These were questions that often came up in their poems. Who am I? Where do I come from? And them trying to answer that question. But there's also this element of, see me for who I am, because there were a lot of poems that had the reference to the mirror, right? So nonfiction, where it was a mirror poem. He was talking from the voice of being a mirror, and how one sees one's own reflection, right? Sometimes reflects the way they perceive how other people see them, but then there's also the way in which you can counter that reflection as long as you can build some kind of fortitude within oneself. De'Ara also had that, like her inner voices too, like, she's constantly in struggle against these voices, and she's trying not to give into these negative thoughts and these negative feelings. And there's this one part in the poem where she actually says, mirror, mirror on the wall, you know what I mean? Like looking to the mirror for answers and sometimes not being happy with what she's seeing, but there's also saying to the audience, because the audience is a mirror too, right? So it's like, see me. Nick, when he's talking about suicide, and it kind of goes back and forth with the poem, like, it seems as though if you're only listening to the poem in a superficial kind of way, like maybe he's actually talking about like actual suicide, but I also think that it becomes metaphorical too, like feeling like an emotional kind of suicide, a spiritual kind of suicide, a psychological, going back to the mental health issue that you were talking about. And he even says in questioning these feelings, saying what do you do when you're already dead on the inside, all of these ways in which and then also the actual calls for help, like De'Ara, like she's saying, making a call for help, Shawnee D, calling out to people, see me for who I am. And so I think it's really important to recognize there was this common theme, like this common thread from poem to poem, where there is this idea of reflection and the double meaning of that, you know what I mean, like the reflection of an outer reality, but also how that reflection affects an inner reality, and then how can you overcome those things when they seem to be putting such a burden on oneself, I
think also the commonality that comes from it. So when nonfiction was talking about racism and the sort of common experience, like it's only a matter of time until we all go through it. So like, the people I'm looking out at have the same problems that I'm experiencing. We have a lot in common, and we're not necessarily addressing what we see right in front of us.
Yeah, and I think it's important to kind of talk about that too, because many of the poets mentioned the internalized racism, the way in which especially as they are talking as poets who identify as being African American, the ways in which dealing and trying to grapple with racism in everyday lives and everyday experiences causes this conditioning where there is this internalization of the racism and also development of perhaps self-hate. And so Logical had a very powerful poem, I thought. He opened up episode 3 by alluding to Dr. Martin Luther King and the idea of progress, and then questioning the way in which there are these things happening in the African American community, and kind of talking to the audience and saying, I mean, he had this refrain, we've been lost for a minute, because progress doesn't mean the work is all finished, right?
Yeah.
And like questioning these, you know, certain values of like being too fixated on materialism and being too fixated on, you know, other things, you know, being, behaving in ways that perhaps could be perceived as being sexist, as being racist towards other people of color. Like these are things that he kind of talked about in that poem.
Yeah, I thought his piece was great because I think it was provocative in the nature of provoking minds, of thinking of, you know, a harsh critique of self, in the sense of just like, what do we do after the marching? What do those steps look like? What does that, like, is it legislation? Is it like, what else do we rally behind to create these, you know, action steps outside of the marching? Because I think, you know, personally, I feel like, you know, what he was speaking on was like, there's these things that happen out of, you know, the civil rights movement, but the work has to continue because that, in a sense, rallied this cause, but we need to keep, you know, calling people to arms because there's so much work to be done. And I thought he, you know, he had you can clearly think, you know, you can clearly see that he thought through his poem, and he was really adamant, not of just saying a critique in the sense of just like society have created these systematic things that we're enduring, but also a critique in the sense of just like, all right, we also must not get complacent because the civil rights movement is over, in a sense. I'm not over, but, you know, in the sense of like, oh, we just think of it as something going. No, like, we still have work to do. There's still things we're enduring. There's still things that are very present in our life. And I thought that was really like, that's the type of like, you know, kind of like, I don't know what to call it, like provoking of like oneself and provoking of a community that we need. I thought that was a great critique, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, one of the things he was talking about was, you know, we have to want this for ourselves.
Yeah.
So we have to want an education too. We have to put ourselves in positions where we can make a positive change, you know what I mean? And I think in many ways, like what he was saying also tied in with what Darlene was saying, like, you know, tribute to her ancestors who were brought to the United States as slaves, but then also recognizing that, you know, she, in terms of honoring their memory, you know, valuing her education, understanding that, you know, she has this responsibility, you know what I mean, to take advantage of certain opportunities in the United States, you know, that whole idea of like freedom is an attitude, you know, but always, it was like this, she, you know, I really liked, you know, again, it's deceptively, it seems so deceptively straightforward, you know what I mean? But when you really listen to it, I mean, she really does straddle this line. It's very ironic because she's acknowledging that pain, you know, the history of her ancestors being brought to the United States as slaves, you know, and their freedoms being taken away from them. But then she's saying that, you know what, being in the United States, I have these opportunities, and I'm going to take advantage of these opportunities as much as possible. So I'm going to get my education, and I'm going to, you know, try to be the best that I can be. So, and then from Darlene, I really wanted to talk about Meek Boss because I thought that her poem, which really she called it Black Lives Matter, right? The title that she shared before she performed it was Black Lives Matter, but it talked about so many important issues, I thought. Like, she talked about, you know, in terms of identifying as being African American, right? This feeling of, in response to the police shootings, feeling, she used this line, throwaway, you know what I mean? Feeling like one is throwaway, like your lives, you know, as an African American doesn't matter. Like, my life as an African American doesn't matter. And what does that mean for her family? And one of the things that really stood out to me in that poem, she told this story, you know, to really make it intimate and to personalize it. She tells a story about how she walked in on her daughter playing with these dolls, and they had and her daughter had the black and white dolls, and you know, and seeing the way in which the black and white dolls were role playing with one another, you know what I mean, which seemed to kind of reflect the racism around them. And I was talking with Elizabeth about this earlier, and you know, there is an actual doll experiment on this. You know, the first one I wanted to look it up, but before we actually had the round table, but I didn't. But I know it was the first experiment was in the 40s or 50s, where these sociologists did this study where they had white children and black children, and they gave them a white doll and they gave them a doll that was black. And then, you know, all the children, not only did they prefer the white doll and say the white doll was more beautiful, but they also put a moral value on the doll. So the white doll was good and the black doll was bad. You know what I mean? And then they actually redid the doll experiment a few years ago. It was like 2011 through 2012. And it was very similar results, like especially with the white children, where they chose the white doll and they said the white doll was more beautiful and the white doll was good, and the black doll was, you know, was not beautiful and was bad. You know, like you used the term bad. And so it's very concerning, you know what I mean? Like people would like to argue that we live in a post-racial society and that we've made all this progress and, you know, and racism doesn't exist, but clearly anti-blackness does exist. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so putting it within that perspective. And so when she talked about that, you know, that very personal experience of seeing her daughter with these dolls, you know, I think that's a very, and being conditioned at such a young age,
yeah.
You know?
We want to think that we're so beyond this, like, oh, racism and with Martin Luther King, but we're still arguing these points of just like, individuals having to say they matter. Like, I'm not more important, I'm not less important, I just matter. Yeah. And that's a really big political, like, controversial thing. Like, I just matter. Like, can we just say I exist? Like, I'm here with you. And, you know, when she said that line, you know, after walking in on her daughter, you know, doing that and, you know, telling the white doll, telling the black doll to sit in the back, and she responds to that saying, like, who told you that? Invoke the speech by Malcolm X in my head of, like, who told you to hate yourself? And it made me think about, like, how are these behaviors being picked up?
Yes.
And, you know, it goes back to what you were saying about these doll experiments. Like, I tried it out, you know, after watching the poem, I Googled beautiful, and I just saw all these faces that didn't look like mine. And that was like, that's just a clear experiment itself. And it was just all these white women. And I was like, none of these faces look like any other races that I see in my world. And why is that? And it's just as simple as that. Like, a simple Google search can show you how far we are from these moments. That's all you have to do is put in beautiful, beautiful women, and you see what pop up.
You know, the point you made earlier, you know, Marquise said that, and Marquise was our feature poet for episodes 3 and 4, and he was also our guest judge, because since Kevin Covington couldn't be with us, and he did a really great job. But, you know, the point that you made earlier, like how sad it is that we're at this moment where we have to declare Black Lives Matter. You know, he actually says that in one of the poems that he performs on this episode, you know. So, you know, and
she has the line too, like, so within the poems, again, there's the generalizations, and then there's the specificity, and there are some lines like she said, we're gonna take a stand living in a world where only whites survive. And I sort of wanted to get some conversation about that, because there is a kind of, there's a truth to that, and then there's also a generality to it, and I just wanted to see what you guys thought about statements that are like that, which may be seen by the audience as, you know, challenging maybe.
I think, you know, sometimes when you talk about white privilege, I think a lot of individuals may get offended by it, because they say they may get into the idea that, you know, saying that is saying that you're not working hard or you don't have this work ethic, you're just giving something. But it's more so speaking to the idea that you're giving the benefit of doubt. Yeah. You're giving this second look, you're giving this chance that is not always afforded to other people. I think to me is that's all, you know, individuals are talking about, in the sense of just like, all right, I'm working as hard, or I'm working, you know, sometimes even harder than you, just to get a second look, you know, because I'm so denied that first look. And that's all, you know, I get ups and arms about this, because, like, when you talk about white privilege, people are easily, like, once to get out the room, where it's in the sense of just like, oh man, you know, you deal with this idea of white guilt, where you can't even talk about the issue, because individuals want to then talk about their own feelings and, like, you made me sad. Instead of just rallying behind a resolve, or the fact that this is a real issue, we have to talk about, oh, you made me feel sad. We talked about slavery, now I feel sad as a white individual, so let's talk more about my feelings of sadness because you talked about slavery, or you talk about being oppressed. When it's like, no, I'm talking about, like, this human thing that if an individual is being oppressed, no matter the race, we should then rally behind that to then, you know, find a resolve and recognize our own privilege to then, you know, find ourselves helping out those individuals given the position that we're benefiting from. And I think that has to be understood, because otherwise we're not able to have these dialogues if we're not going to be able to recognize the white privilege in the room.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you just said is so very important, because and I don't know what to attribute this to. Like, some people say it's because of the way in which social media has become such an obsession in people's lives, and the culture of taking selfies constantly, or this me culture. But it's like, we can't have, it seems like, generally speaking, people can't have a dialogue without feeling like they have to make sure their voice is heard over someone else's voice, instead of just simply listening.
Yeah.
Like, someone needs to share something, and it's something that maybe they feel as though people haven't been acknowledging, or they've been too afraid to share, or they're afraid they're going to be judged, or whatever the reason is, right? And instead of saying, I hear what you've said, and I'm so sorry that you've had that experience, and how can I help? What can I do? Instead of saying something like that, to acknowledge, right, and to really make a person feel like they've been heard. Instead, what sometimes people do is they say, oh, well, you went through that? Well, I went through this. You know what I mean? And it's like, but it's not done in a way to show connection, right? It's done in a way to kind of like silence them, you know what I mean? To put the hand up and say, I don't really want to hear what you have to say, you know what I mean? And that's unfortunate.
I found it within my classes as a white professor that sometimes students feel hesitant to talk about the idea of white privilege because I'm in the front of the room. And I think that that's kind of disturbing too, like what message has been sent that you can't authentically express who you are within the classroom. So I think classroom spaces have to also be a space where we can listen to whatever's coming forward in the moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think the last episode we talked about, sometimes we do poems and we feel as though we're preaching to the choir, but I also feel as though sometimes, we assume that we're preaching to the choir when actually the room is as diverse as the personalities that we all have. And sometimes if we don't talk about this, the person and the in the crowd will just go about not knowing, not acknowledging, not recognizing. And I think that's very important, because like so many of these pieces were moments where I was like, I gotta know more about this. I have to learn more about this. I wasn't aware of this before. And I like to think of myself as a pretty informed, progressive person, but there's moments every single day where I'm picking up on something because I'm in these spaces that I'm learning.
Great conversation. So there we have it. Season 3, episode 3 of 2-time Emmy-nominated Drop the Mic. Please enjoy.